Tomatoes are one of the most rewarding plants you can grow in your garden. But many times you end up with large plants, lots of leaves, but not a ton of tomatoes. And isn't that the most frustrating thing in the world? Where after all your hard work, you don't get the harvest you deserve? So in this video, I'll walk you through why this happens, and what simple steps you can take to make sure you get tons of tomatoes. Plus, if you stay with me till the end, I'll share a bonus tip that will increase the fruit on your plants, help them ripen faster, and keep them producing longer into the season. But I'll only tell you that if you stick around with me to the end. Now here's the thing. Most gardeners don't realize that the biggest reason tomato plants grow huge and leafy, but don't produce much fruit starts way before you even put the plant in the ground. It starts with your soil. Tomatoes need certain nutrients to thrive, but not all nutrients do the same job. There are three main nutrients we talk about in gardening: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You'll see them listed on fertilizer bags as NPK. Nitrogen is the first number, phosphorus is the second, and potassium is the third. Now, nitrogen is fantastic for leaf growth. It's what makes plants green, bushy, and full of foliage. But here's where most people go wrong. If your soil has too much nitrogen, your tomato plant will put all its energy into growing leaves and stems, and it'll basically forget about making fruit. Phosphorus, on the other hand, is what encourages root development and flower production. And flowers, of course, turn into tomatoes. So if you want more fruit and fewer leaves, you need to make sure your soil has a good balance. Enough nitrogen to keep the plant healthy, but plenty of phosphorus to push it toward fruiting. Before you plant your tomatoes, it's worth testing your soil. You can pick up a simple soil test kit at most garden centers, or send a sample to your local extension office. What you're looking for is a phosphorus level that's at least as high as your nitrogen level, if not higher. If your soil is heavy in nitrogen, maybe because you've been adding a lot of compost or manure, your tomatoes are going to grow like crazy, but they won't fruit well. Here's what to do. If your test shows high nitrogen, hold off on adding more compost or nitrogen-rich fertilizers before planting. Instead, work in some bone meal or rock phosphate. Both of these are high in phosphorus and will help balance things out. You don't need a lot. Just follow the package directions. Mix it into the top 6 to 8 inches of soil where your tomato roots will be living. What happens if you skip this step? Well, you'll get a big, beautiful plant. It'll look healthy. Your neighbors might even compliment you on it. But come midsummer, you'll be standing there wondering why you've only got a handful of tomatoes while your plant looks like it could take over the garden. That's because all the energy went into leaves, not fruit. A common mistake here is thinking that more fertilizer always equals more production. It doesn't. In fact, over-fertilizing with the wrong type of fertilizer is one of the fastest ways to end up with a tomato plant that's all show and no harvest. You'll want to remember this part. Feed your soil for fruit, not just for green growth. So just to recap, test your soil before planting, balance your nitrogen and phosphorus levels, and if needed, add bone meal or rock phosphate to encourage flowering and fruiting instead of endless leafy growth. Now that we've talked about soil, let's talk about the tomato plant itself, because not all tomato plants grow the same way, and understanding the difference can make a huge impact on how much fruit you actually get. There are two main types of tomato plants: determinate and indeterminate, and honestly, a lot of gardeners don't pay much attention to this when they're buying seedlings at the nursery, but it matters more than you might think. Determinate tomatoes are often called bush tomatoes. They grow to a certain height, usually around 3 to 4 feet, and then they stop. They set all their flowers at roughly the same time, which means all their fruit ripens within a couple of weeks. It's like one big harvest. These are great if you're planning to make sauce, or can your tomatoes, because you get a lot of fruit all at once. They're also easier to manage, because they don't keep growing and sprawling all season long. Indeterminate tomatoes, on the other hand, are the ones that just keep going. They're often called vining tomatoes. They'll grow 6, 8, even 10 feet tall if you let them, and they keep producing flowers and fruit throughout the entire growing season until frost kills them. That sounds great, right? And it can be. But here's the catch. If you don't manage them properly, indeterminate tomatoes will put a lot of energy into growing more and more vines and leaves, and less energy into actually ripening the fruit that's already there. So why does this matter for getting more tomatoes and fewer leaves? Well, if you choose an indeterminate variety and you don't prune it or support it well, you're going to end up with a massive, sprawling plant that's hard to control. It'll have tons of stems and foliage, but the fruit production might not match the size of the plant. The plant is basically spending so much energy on growth that it can't focus on ripening what it's already produced. Here's what to do. If you're someone who likes a tidy garden and doesn't want to fuss too much with pruning and staking, go with determinate varieties. You'll get a concentrated harvest, the plants stay compact, and you won't be wrestling with vines all summer. But if you want tomatoes all season long and you're willing to put in a bit more work, indeterminate varieties are fantastic. You just need to be ready to prune and support them, which we'll talk about in a later tip. What happens if you don't choose wisely? Well, you might plant an indeterminate variety thinking you're going to get tons of tomatoes, but then you don't prune it and it turns into a jungle. You'll have a huge plant, lots of green growth, and not nearly as many ripe tomatoes as you expected. Or you might plant all determinates and then be disappointed when your harvest is over in 2 weeks and you're left with nothing for the rest of the summer. A common mistake here is not reading the plant tag at all. Many gardeners just grab whatever looks good at the nursery without checking whether it's determinate or indeterminate. Then they're surprised when the plant doesn't behave the way they thought it would. You'll want to remember this part. The type of tomato you choose sets the stage for how much work you'll need to do and what kind of harvest you'll get. So just to recap, determinate tomatoes give you one big harvest and stay compact, while indeterminate tomatoes produce all season, but need more management. Choose the type that fits your gardening style and your goals for the season. All right, let's talk about watering, because this is one of those areas where good intentions can actually work against you. A lot of gardeners think that more water means more tomatoes. And while tomatoes do need regular water, especially when they're setting fruit, it's not about giving them as much as possible. It's about giving them a steady, consistent amount. The key word here is consistent. Here's why this matters. When a tomato plant experiences big swings in water availability, going from bone dry to soaking wet and back again, it stresses the plant out. And a stressed plant doesn't produce well. In fact, inconsistent watering causes some of the most common tomato problems you'll see: blossom end rot, fruit cracking, and weak fruit set. Let's start with blossom end rot. You've probably seen this before. It's when the bottom of the tomato turns black and leathery. It looks like a disease, but it's actually a calcium deficiency. Now here's the thing. Most soil has plenty of calcium in it. The problem isn't that the calcium isn't there. It's that the plant can't take it up properly when watering is inconsistent. Calcium moves through the plant with water. If the water supply is erratic, the calcium can't get where it needs to go, and you end up with blossom end rot. Then there's cracking. If your tomato plant goes from desert dry to flood conditions, cracking of the fruit is most likely going to happen. The tomato fruit expands and grows by pulling water in from the rest of the plant. If they've gone without water for a while, the fruit might have become a bit dehydrated, and it's going to suck in as much water as it can at the next watering time, more than its skin can take. It's kind of like if you gain a lot of weight really fast, or if you're an adolescent and you grow 2 inches. Really quickly, you're going to get stretch marks. So it's pretty much the same thing, except on tomatoes, those stretch marks crack open. And then there's fruit set. When a tomato plant is stressed from inconsistent watering, it might drop its flowers before they ever turn into fruit. The plant is basically in survival mode, and it's not going to waste energy on reproduction if it doesn't think it can support the fruit. So here's what to do. Set up a watering schedule and stick to it. For most climates, tomatoes need about 1 to 2 inches of water per week. That can come from rain, or from you, or a combination of both. The best way to water is deeply and less often, rather than a little bit every day. Deep watering encourages the roots to grow down into the soil, which makes the plant stronger and more drought-resistant over time. Water in the morning if you can, and water at the base of the plant, not from overhead. Wet leaves can lead to fungal diseases, and you don't want that. If you're using a hose, just let the water soak in slowly around the base. If you're using a drip system or soaker hose, even better. That's the most consistent method there is. What happens if you don't water consistently? Well, we've already covered the big three: blossom end rot, cracking, and drop flowers. But there's another issue too. When a plant gets too much water all at once, and it tends to put energy into growing more leaves and stems instead of fruit. It's like the plant thinks, oh, conditions are great, time to get bigger, instead of time to make tomatoes. So inconsistent watering doesn't just hurt the fruit you already have. It can also reduce how much new fruit the plant sets. A common mistake here is watering whenever you think about it, or only when the plant looks wilted. By the time a tomato plant wilts, it's already stressed. You'll want to remember this part. Consistency is more important than quantity. A steady, reliable water supply keeps the plant calm, healthy, and focused on producing fruit instead of just surviving. So just to recap, water deeply and consistently. Aim for 1 to 2 inches per week. And avoid the swings from dry to soaked that cause cracking, blossom end rot, and drop flowers. If you're still watching this video and finding these insights valuable, please comment number 4 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I recommend you subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Your support helps us keep creating helpful content. Now let's talk about pruning, and this is where a lot of gardeners either do too much, too little, or nothing at all. But understanding why we prune tomatoes and how to do it right can make a huge difference in how much fruit you actually harvest. In order to understand why we prune, we need to understand how a tomato grows naturally, or how it wants to grow anyway. Tomatoes are not plants like peppers that are pretty, much established when they're established. Peppers are tall, upright plants and might need staking if there's a lot of fruit hanging from them or if it's windy. But for the most part, they kind of do well on their own, standing up and keeping the fruit off the ground. That is the exact opposite of a tomato. A tomato's main goal is to spread its seeds as far out as it can. In the wild, tomatoes sprawl along the ground. They send out new stems from every leaf joint, and those stems grow out, touch the ground, root themselves, and then send out even more stems. It's a survival strategy. The more the plant spreads, the better chance its seeds have of finding a good spot to grow next year. But here's the problem for us as gardeners. All that sprawling and stem growth takes energy. And the more energy the plant puts into making new vines and leaves, the less it has available for ripening fruit. So pruning is really about redirecting that energy. You're telling the plant, stop trying to take over the garden and focus on the tomatoes you've already started. It's not about making the plant smaller just for the sake of neatness. It's about making it more productive. Here's what to do. If you're growing indeterminate tomatoes, which we talked about earlier, you'll want to prune regularly throughout the season. The main thing you're looking for are called suckers. A sucker is a new shoot that grows in the joint between the main stem and a leaf branch. If you look closely at your tomato plant, you'll see these little shoots popping out all over the place. Each one of those suckers wants to become a whole new stem with its own leaves, flowers, and fruit. Sounds good, right? But the reality is, if you let every sucker grow, you'll end up with a massive, tangled plant that's spending more energy on growth than on ripening. For most gardeners, the best approach is to remove the suckers below the first flower cluster. These lower suckers aren't going to produce much fruit anyway, and they tend to crowd the base of the plant, which reduces airflow and increases the chance of disease. Once you get above the first flower cluster, you can choose to let one or two main stems develop, or you can keep removing suckers and stick with just one main stem. A single stem plant will give you fewer tomatoes overall, but they'll ripen faster. A two-stem plant gives you more fruit, but it takes a bit longer. To remove a sucker, just pinch it off with your fingers when it's still small, about 2 to 4 inches long. It'll snap right off. If you wait until it's bigger, you'll need pruners, and you'll be removing a lot more plant material, which can stress the plant. Do this every week or so, especially during the height of summer when the plant is growing fast. Now, if you're growing determinate tomatoes, you don't need to prune nearly as much. These plants naturally stop growing at a certain point, so they're not going to turn into a jungle. You can still remove any damaged or diseased leaves, and you can take off suckers near the bottom for better airflow, but otherwise let them be. What happens if you don't prune at all? Well, your indeterminate tomatoes will grow into a dense thicket of stems and leaves. It might look impressive, but you'll have a harder time finding the fruit. The airflow will be poor, and diseases like early blight and powdery mildew will have an easier time taking hold. Plus, the plant will keep putting energy into new growth instead of ripening the tomatoes that are already there. You'll end up with lots of green tomatoes late in the season that never had a chance to mature. A common mistake here is being afraid to prune. Many gardeners worry that they'll hurt the plant or reduce their harvest. But the opposite is true. Pruning actually increases your harvest of ripe, usable tomatoes because the plant can focus its energy. You'll want to remember this part. Pruning isn't about cutting the plant back. It's about directing its energy toward fruit instead of endless vines. So just to recap, remove suckers regularly on indeterminate tomatoes to redirect energy into ripening fruit. Prune below the first flower cluster for better airflow. And don't be afraid to take off those extra shoots. Your plant will thank you with a better harvest. All right, let's talk about fertilizing. Because just like with watering, timing and balance matter a whole lot more than just throwing plant food at your tomatoes and hoping for the best. Here's the thing that most gardeners don't realize. The fertilizer you use at the beginning of the season shouldn't be the same fertilizer you use once your tomatoes start flowering and setting fruit. And if you keep feeding your plants the wrong type of fertilizer all season long, you're going to end up with exactly what we've been talking about: big, leafy plants and not much harvest. Let's go back to those 3 main nutrients we mentioned earlier: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. In the early stages of growth, when your tomato plant is just a seedling or a young transplant, it needs nitrogen to build strong stems and healthy leaves. That's perfectly fine. A balanced fertilizer, something like a 10-10-10, or even a bit higher in nitrogen, works well during this time. The plant is establishing itself, building its structure, and getting ready to produce. But here's where things need to change. Once your plant starts flowering, its job shifts. It's no longer focused on getting bigger, it's focused on reproduction, which means making fruit. And fruit production requires phosphorus and potassium much more than it requires nitrogen. Phosphorus supports flower development and helps those flowers turn into baby tomatoes. Potassium helps with fruit quality, flavor, and disease resistance. Nitrogen, on the other hand, keeps pushing leaf and stem growth. And if you keep feeding a high nitrogen fertilizer after the plant has started flowering, you're basically telling it, keep growing bigger, instead of, focus on ripening those tomatoes. Here's what to do. Once you see the first flowers starting to open on your tomato plants, it's time to switch fertilizers. Look for a formula that's lower in nitrogen and higher in phosphorus and potassium. Something like a 5-10-10 or even a bloom booster fertilizer designed for fruiting plants works really well. Tomato-specific fertilizers are often formulated this way, so if you see one labeled for tomatoes, check the numbers on the bag. You want that first number, the nitrogen, to be lower than the other two. Apply this fertilizer according to the package directions, usually every 2 to 3 weeks throughout the growing season. You can use a granular fertilizer that you sprinkle around the base of the plant and water in, or you can use a liquid fertilizer that you mix with water and pour on. Either way works fine, as long as you're consistent and you're not overdoing it. What happens if you keep using high nitrogen fertilizer all season? Well, your plant will keep putting out new leaves and stems. It'll look lush and green and healthy. But the fruit that's already set won't ripen as quickly, and the plant won't be as motivated to set new fruit. You'll end up with a big, beautiful plant in August with a bunch of green tomatoes that just sit there, not turning red. Meanwhile, your neighbor who switched to a bloom fertilizer back in June is bringing in baskets of ripe tomatoes every few days. On the flip side, if you don't fertilize at all after planting, your plant might run out of steam halfway through the season. Tomatoes are heavy feeders, especially indeterminate varieties that keep growing and producing. Without the right nutrients, flower production slows down, fruit size decreases, and the plant becomes more susceptible to diseases and pests. A common mistake here is thinking that fertilizer is fertilizer, and it doesn't matter which one you use. It absolutely matters. You'll want to remember this part. Match your fertilizer to what the plant is trying to do. Early on, it's building structure, so nitrogen is fine. Once it's flowering and fruiting, switch to phosphorus and potassium to support that process. Another mistake is over-fertilizing because you think more is better. Too much of any fertilizer can actually harm your plants. It can burn the roots, cause salt buildup in the soil, and lead to nutrient imbalances. Stick to the recommended amounts, and if you're not sure, it's better to under-fertilize a little than to overdo it. So just to recap, use a balanced or slightly higher nitrogen fertilizer early in the season, then switch to a lower nitrogen, higher phosphorus and potassium formula once flowers appear. Feed regularly, but not excessively, and you'll support fruit production instead of just leaf growth. Now let's talk about support. And I don't mean emotional support, though your tomatoes might appreciate that too. I'm talking about staking, caging, or trellising your plants. And while this might seem like it's just about keeping your garden tidy or preventing your tomatoes from sprawling all over the place, proper support actually has a direct impact on how much fruit your plants produce and how healthy that fruit is. Here's why support matters for fruit production. When a tomato plant is left to sprawl on the ground, a few things happen. First, the stems and leaves are lying in the dirt, which means they're in contact with soil-borne diseases and pests. Fungal spores from the soil can splash up onto the leaves when it rains or when you water, and that leads to problems like early blight, late blight, and septoria leaf spot. Once a plant is diseased, it puts energy into trying to survive instead of producing and ripening fruit. Second, when a plant is sprawling, airflow around the leaves and stems is poor. All those leaves are piled on top of each other, staying damp longer after rain or morning dew. That damp, crowded environment is perfect for fungal diseases and mildew. Good airflow, on the other hand, helps leaves dry quickly and keeps the plant healthier overall. A healthy plant produces more fruit, plain and simple. Third, and this is something many gardeners don't think about, a supported plant can put its energy into fruit instead of into constantly producing new stems that try to root themselves. Remember, tomatoes naturally want to sprawl and spread. When you lift them up and support them, you're working against that instinct, and the plant responds by focusing more on reproduction, making fruit, rather than just spreading out. Here's what to do. The type of support you choose depends on whether you're growing determinate or indeterminate tomatoes. For determinate varieties, a sturdy tomato cage is usually enough. These plants stop growing at a certain height, so they won't outgrow a good cage. Look for cages that are at least 4 feet tall and made of heavy gauge wire. Those flimsy cone-shaped cages you see at the hardware store might work for small plants, but most tomato varieties will outgrow them or knock them over. For indeterminate tomatoes, you'll want something stronger. A tall stake, at least 6 feet driven a foot into the ground, works well. You can use wooden stakes, metal stakes, or even bamboo poles. As the plant grows, tie the main stem to the stake every foot or so using soft garden twine or strips of cloth. Don't tie too tightly. You want to support the plant, not strangle it. Leave a little room for the stem to grow and move. Another option for indeterminate tomatoes is a trellis system. You can string heavy twine or wire between 2 posts and weave the tomato stems through as they grow, or use a cattle panel propped up between stakes. This works especially well if you're growing multiple plants in a row. The key is to start supporting your plants early. Don't wait until they're flopping over. By the time a tomato plant is leaning or sprawling, it's harder to get it upright without damaging stems or fruit. What happens if you don't support your plants? Well, you're going to have tomatoes sitting on the ground, which means they'll rot more easily, get eaten by slugs and other pests, and develop soft spots where they touch the soil. You'll also have a much higher chance of disease because of poor airflow and soil contact. And here's the frustrating part. You'll have plenty of green growth, but less ripe fruit, because the plant is stressed and spending energy on fighting disease instead of ripening tomatoes. A common mistake here is thinking that support is optional, or that you can add it later if the plant needs it. By the time you realize the plant needs support, it's often already sprawling, and trying to lift it up and tie it at that point can break stems and knock off fruit. You'll want to remember this part. Support your plants from the beginning, while they're still small and manageable. It's much easier to guide a young plant than to wrestle a 6-foot-tall, fruit-laden vine into submission. Another mistake is using support that's too weak. A flimsy stake or a lightweight cage might look fine in June, but by August, when your plant is loaded with fruit and hit by a summer storm, it's going to collapse. Invest in good, sturdy support, and it'll last you for years. So just to recap, support your tomato plants early with stakes, cages, or trellises to improve airflow, reduce disease, and help the plant focus its energy on producing and ripening fruit instead of sprawling and surviving. All right, here's the bonus tip I promised you at the beginning. And this one is a game changer if you're growing indeterminate tomatoes and you want to see more ripe fruit before the season ends. It's called topping, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You cut off the top growing tip of your tomato plant. Now I know that might sound drastic, and a lot of gardeners are hesitant to do it because it feels like you're hurting the plant or limiting its potential. But here's the thing. Topping doesn't hurt the plant at all. In fact, it helps the plant do what you actually want it to do, which is ripen the fruit that's already there, instead of wasting energy on new growth that won't have time to mature. Let's talk about why this works. Indeterminate tomatoes, as we discussed earlier, just keep growing. They'll keep sending out new stems, new leaves, and new flowers all the way until frost kills them. That's great in theory, but in reality, there comes a point in the season, usually mid to late summer, when any new flowers that form aren't going to have enough time to turn into ripe tomatoes before cold weather arrives. If you live in a climate with a shorter growing season, this is especially true. Those late season flowers might set fruit, but that fruit will still be green and hard when the first frost hits. So what's the plant doing during this time? It's putting energy into growing taller, making new leaves, and trying to produce more flowers and fruit. But all that energy could be going into ripening the tomatoes that are already on the plant. That's where topping comes in. When you cut off the growing tip, you stop the upward growth. The plant can't get any taller. And when the plant realizes it can't grow anymore, it shifts gears. It takes all that energy it was using for growth and redirects it into the fruit. The tomatoes that are already set will ripen faster, grow a bit larger, and develop better flavor. Here's what to do. The timing of topping depends on your climate and when your first expected frost is. In most areas, you'll want to top your indeterminate tomatoes about 4 to 6 weeks before your average first frost date. If you're not sure when that is, you can look it up online for your zip code or ask at your local garden center. The idea is to give the plant enough time to ripen the existing fruit, but not so early that you're cutting off production when the plant could still be setting useful fruit. To top the plant, just use clean pruning shears and cut off the main growing tip at the top of the plant. You're removing the topmost cluster of leaves and any tiny new growth above the last flower cluster. Don't worry about being too precise. You're just stopping the plant from growing taller. After you make the cut, the plant will focus on the fruit that's already there. You'll notice that tomatoes start to change color faster, and the ones that were stuck in that in-between stage, not quite green, not quite ripe, will start to turn. Now this technique works especially well for indeterminate tomatoes, because they're the ones that keep growing indefinitely. Determinate tomatoes, on the other hand, naturally stop growing on their own, so there's no need to top them. They've already made the decision to focus on ripening their fruit. But if you've got indeterminate varieties and you're looking at a bunch of green tomatoes in late summer, topping is one of the best things you can do to make sure you actually get to enjoy those tomatoes instead of watching them sit there green until frost takes them out. What happens if you don't top your plants? Well, they'll keep growing and trying to produce new fruit right up until the end of the season. And that sounds good, but the reality is, you'll end up with a lot of green tomatoes that never ripen. You might have flowers in September and tiny green tomatoes forming in October, but none of that matters if they don't have time to mature. Meanwhile, the tomatoes that set back in July are still sitting there, slowly ripening, because the plant is dividing its energy between ripening old fruit and trying to make new fruit. Let's compare this to peppers for a moment, because it helps clarify the difference. Peppers are determinate by nature. Once a pepper plant reaches its mature size, it stops growing taller and focuses entirely on flowering and fruiting. You don't need to top a pepper plant because it's already made that decision for itself. But indeterminate tomatoes never make that decision. They just keep going. So topping a tomato is like giving it the same signal that a pepper plant gives itself. Okay, we're done growing. Let's finish what we started. Another way to think about it is this. Imagine you're working on 10 different projects at once. You're making a little progress on each one, but nothing's really getting finished. Now imagine someone tells you, stop starting new projects. Just finish the ones you've already got. Suddenly you can focus. You complete things faster. That's exactly what topping does for a tomato plant. A common mistake here is topping too early in the season. If you stop in June or early July, you're cutting off production when the plant still has plenty of time to set and ripen new fruit. You want to wait until late summer when the season is winding down and there's a clear end point in sight. Another mistake is being too aggressive with topping. You're not trying to turn your indeterminate plant into a bush. You're just removing the top growing tip. Leave the rest of the plant alone. All those side branches with fruit on them should stay right where they are. You'll also want to remember this part. Topping is especially useful if you're trying to beat an early frost. or if you've got a lot of green tomatoes and you're running out of time. It's a small habit that takes just a few seconds per plant, but it can make a big difference in how much ripe fruit you harvest before the season ends. One more thing, after you top your plants, keep up with your regular care. Keep watering consistently, keep an eye out for pests and diseases, and keep harvesting ripe tomatoes as they come in. Topping doesn't mean the plant is done, it just means it's focused. You're giving it a clear direction, and it'll respond by ripening fruit faster and more efficiently. So just to recap, topping is the practice of cutting off the top growing tip of indeterminate tomato plants about 4 to 6 weeks before your first expected frost. It redirects the plant's energy from making new growth to ripening existing fruit, which means you get more ripe tomatoes and fewer green ones left on the vine. It's a small habit, but it can make a big difference. Leave a comment below and share one thing you learned today. Your thoughts are important to us. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please like, subscribe, and share.